what's up everybody, welcome back to another video review, and today, as you can see, I am trying to figure out how good is the AMD's, or let's say ASUS-s AMD TUF RX 7900 XTX. Is it better than the Nvidia's RTX 4080 or not? So that's what I'm trying to figure out in today's video. So if you're interested in that, stick around because it should be a pretty interesting video. Because I'm gonna be comparing these two cards, both in games and in terms of price. Because I did go on to Amazon and checked out what are the price differences, right? You know, one card can be a little bit faster, but how much is it like cheaper, right? So at the end of the day, what I figured out was that the RX 7900 XTX starts at about $1,000, and the 4080 starts at around 1,000, maybe 1,100 to 1,300. But also the 7900 XTX was about the same, right? The most cheapest that I found was $1,000, but the average price was like 1,200 to 1,300. So they're pretty similar actually in terms of price. But how good is the 7900 XTX really, right? So yeah, first of all, coming to the TUF RX 7900 XTX, right? Well, yeah, it's big. No, really, I mean, it's freaking big. It is so large that I had to take a power tool to cut a piece out of my brand spanking new TUF GT502 case to make it fit horizontally, even though they were both TUF products. A bit of an error from ASUS' side, but the card itself is looking super tough. I mean really, the build quality looks and feels very high-end. No cheap plastic parts, just raw metal and PCB. So when we actually take a bit of a closer look at the card, we can see that this thing has three very big fans that ASUS calls their axial deck fans. And yeah, the middle fan is spinning opposite to the outer fans, which is pretty interesting. And yeah, they are very efficient in blowing maximum amount of air onto the card to keep it very cool. And well, yeah, cool it is. The fans only spin up when the temps go above 55 to 60 degrees Celsius, meaning it is going to save the fan life in the long run and also stays passively cooled when you're not playing games. This, although, will depend a bit on your overall case airflow, but as the radiator is just super massive here, it will do a good job wherever this card is fitted into. You might be wondering, well, you know, how big is it then, right? Well, it's a 3.63 slot design. I mean, really, take a ruler and measure your case if the card even fits. The exact measurements you can find on ASUS' website that I'm gonna be linking down below in the description. But hey, I mean, you can always cut metal out of your case, I guess. Although I really think this thing is just too big. It doesn't need to be this large. You can see why when I test the actual maximum temperatures while gaming in the benchmarking section. And yeah, some other things other than the cooling solution, ASUS has brought military grade capacitors to this thing, and it has a very nice backplate with a tiny bit of RGB as well, which in my opinion they should really start adding more onto the TUF lineup of cards. But okay, let's come to the most important stuff, the benchmarking. How good was the RX 7900 XTX versus the 4080? And yeah, I ran through, you know, a lot of different benchmarks like 3D Marks and CYBERPUNK 2077, WARZONE 2.0, Grand Theft Auto 5, stuff like that. So if you're interested in that, we're gonna be benching it right now. And I'm gonna be using my test rig, which is the Intel Core i9 13900K running on Windows 11. So yeah, everything pretty much turned to the max in terms of hardware and in terms of gaming graphical quality. So all the games that I'm running here are cranked to the most maximum detail possible, and before I run the benchmark I will show you the exact menu graphical settings that I used, so you can, you know, do the same at home and see if my results are correct or not, right? And yeah, I do want to note that I took the 4080 and reran all the benchmarks just so that everything would be fair, right? Games might get updates over time and drivers get updated as well. So for the RTX 4080 I was using the 531.18 drivers, while the AMD was using the 23.2.2. But alright, let's kick things off with 3D Marks. First off, I ran through 3D Mark TIMESPY Extreme, and the AMD 7900 XTX scored 14,132 points, compared to the 4080's 14,048 points. Then I ran through 3D Mark Port Royale, where the 7900 XTX got a score of 15,870 points versus the 4080's 18,225 points. Actually pretty odd, cause the 7900 XTX beat the 4080 in TIMESPY Extreme, but then lost in Port Royale. Very interesting. Next up was my first gaming benchmark, which was Assassin's Creed VALHALLA, with anti-aliasing turned to the lowest detail, as you can't turn it off. And yeah, the AMD RX 7900 XTX scored on average FPS of 128 frames per second versus the 4080's 124 FPS. So as you can see, a bit faster here it seems, which is pretty nice, although not by much. So next up was Far Cry 6. So I ran two different tests here. The first test was max detail as always, right? And the 7900 XTX got an average FPS of 124 frames per second, with the RTX 4080 receiving 115 frames per second. Again, the AMD comes out on top, but let's enable ray tracing support and see how these two cards fare then. So RTX enabled and the 7900 XTX scored 105 frames per second versus the 4080's 100 frames per second. Very close, but AMD stays on top. Next up was Grand Theft Auto 5, all the graphical settings to the max, even in the advanced graphical menu, and the results for the fourth and the longest pass was 157.6 frames per second with the 7900 XTX, and almost the same on the RTX 4080 with an average FPS of 155.5 frames per second. Now moving along to Counter-Strike Global Offensive, a game that is still super popular, and there are even talks about a sequel that should launch any day now, which is a nice surprise. So you might be wondering, could I get decent FPS out of the 7900 XTX on 4K resolution? Well, all the graphical settings cranked to the max, 4K, no anti-aliasing, and the 7900 XTX got around 360 to 390 frames per second as average, and pretty much the same on the 4080, so near identical frame rates here, and yeah, pretty ideal for Counter-Strike with a super high refresh rate monitor. Now, next up was Call of Duty Warzone 2.0. Again, everything turned to the most maximum detail possible, and heading into my benchmarking section, and the FPS was 127 frames per second on the 7900 XTX, while the 4080 got 116 frames per second. That's a pretty big difference versus the two cards. And yeah, finally coming to Cyberpunk 2077, right? Here I ran through multiple different scenarios, so should be pretty interesting to see how both of these cards can handle 2023's crisis, right? And what one has over the other in terms of technology. So first of all, 4K, max detail, no ray tracing, and no AMD's Fidelity FX Super Res or DLSS for Nvidia. The 7900 XTX got 41.8 frames per second, while the 4080 managed 36.9. And next I decided to turn on ray tracing on psycho settings, and by doing so the FPS dipped to 18.6 frames per second on the 7900 XTX and 28.6 on the 4080. It seems that Nvidia's RT cores are doing a much better job than what AMD has to offer, although I wouldn't call 28 frames per second gaming. After that test, I also enabled AMD's Fidelity FX Super Res and DLSS on Nvidia's card with ray tracing turned on psycho settings. This way the 7900 XTX got 79.7 frames per second, while the 4080 got a whopping 111.8 FPS. That's a pretty huge difference in favor of Nvidia, even though I use the ultra performance on both AMD and Nvidia for, Fidelity FX and DLSS settings. So lastly, I decided to disable ray tracing support, but still leave AMD's Fidelity FX on for 7900 XTX and Nvidia's DLSS for the 4080. In which case the 7900 XTX got a result of a whopping 165 frames per second, while the 4080 got 190.8 FPS. Now, the main thing to take away is that Nvidia is also offering DLSS 3.0 support on their 4000 series of cards, which is of course a frame generation add-on that when enabled will even further boost the FPS while letting the AI generate extra frames while not impacting the image quality that much. It has to be mentioned because AMD does still not offer this support. They've talked about the FSR 3.0, but yeah, it's nowhere to be found to date. Now, talking about the maximum temperatures. The TUF AMD RX 7900 XTX did not go over 67 degrees, which is just super chill. And again, coming back to the size of the radiator, I mean, really, it doesn't need such a huge cooler, because it is hard to fit this thing into most cases out there, so it would have made much more sense to make it a little bit smaller, right? It wouldn't cool as well, but do you need such good cooling solution? I mean, you can give away here, make the temperatures go to 76, maybe even 80, but maybe have like 2 times smaller cooler on this thing and still get the job done, still be as quiet, right? So yeah, I mean, ASUS definitely, I guess other companies as well, went a little bit overboard with the cooling solution for this exact card. Alright, so that about wraps up all the benchmarks that I did with this RX 7900 XTX and the 4080, and I mean overall the 7900 XTX really impressed me in terms of performance, right? And AMD's Fidelity FX Super Resolution, compares pretty well with Nvidia's DLSS, so you still get pretty much everything, right? Ray tracing and the Super Resolution, right? So yeah, I mean overall, it's a great card. But one thing that I actually hated, I think AMD actually doesn't want you to be using their software. Because when comparing AMD's Adrenalin software to Nvidia's GeForce Experience and of course AMD's Relive versus the Nvidia Shadowblade, I actually felt like AMD just didn't want me to use this software. I like to record stuff, I like to do game recording or just capture some cool moments in game, shorter or longer. Then yeah, first of all, out of the box, the videos that I captured, none of them had thumbnails in Windows 11, which is like, I can't navigate videos like that, right? So then I found out that I needed to change the codec, so I changed the codec, then I got the thumbnails to show up, right? But then when I played the video, it was like super glitchy. Then I found another thing that I needed to disable in Windows 11, so I disabled that. Then the videos were working fine finally. But then another problem, when I actually tried to record longer than like 5 minutes, when I stopped recording, the entire game crashed. and AMD's Adrenalin software put out an error, and when I closed the error, I couldn't open Adrenalin software at all. I had to restart the PC to be able to record again. And also, when going into games to record stuff, right, with a hotkey, right, I couldn't just use a single hotkey. I had to have an Alt or Control hotkey, and it didn't work. I had to open the in-game or the in-game AMD software, like with an Alt Z or whatever it was, and then manually go with a mouse on the record button. What the freaking hell, AMD? What are you doing? It is so user hostile, right? It's not user friendly, it's actually user hostile. So that was my biggest complaint about AMD's cards in general, I guess, because I'm pretty sure that's the case with all AMD's cards, right? Maybe it works better for you, maybe you don't have these issues, but I did, and all the time when I get an AMD card, these kind of issues come up, like what are you doing? What are you doing, AMD? Anyway, my final verdict for ASUS-s TUF AMD RX 7900 XTX is an 8 out of 10. I mean, it is a really good card. It is faster than the 4080, but I really freaking hate their software support, and I can never give it a higher score than 8 just because of the software. Whatever the card is. Okay, maybe I'll give it a 9 if it's like 20 or 30% faster than the competitor, right, at the same price range. Anyway, that's gonna conclude my quick little review from the 7900 XTX. I mean, overall it's a powerful card, but my god, AMD really needs to freaking fix their software support, which is absolutely horrendous in 2023. It's 2023, it's not 2006. Anyway, thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, leave them down below in the comment section, and yeah, ciao for now.